Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I wanted to thank David Tabucci and Mark Healy and all of their authors for this book, The Ripple Effect, because I think it's an excellent way to understand what networking is all about, and through stories rather than the how-to book. I'm going to break what they talked about, though, and then give you a how-to book because I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I actually did 3/4 of a doctorate in business on this topic. I haven't finished it. I finished all the credit work, but I haven't finished my thesis. I've got a good first draft, but I haven't finished it. I got to finish it eventually. And the reason why is because I started out trying to understand what the key to economic development and entrepreneurship was. And I thought initially it was about, the leader, and or money, capital, because I'm a finance guy historically. And I came to the conclusion after a lot of research, a lot of talking, some interviews, that it was really, frankly, relationships that were the key. Teamwork, building teams, trust, things like that ended up being far more important in successful evolutions of businesses, creations of business, growth of businesses, and economic development, whether they be in an ecosystem, in a cluster, whatever you want to call it, in a city. And so I want to talk a little about that. And I developed something called the 10 powers of co. And the reason why it's co is because co is the Greek word that means with or together. And I think that's key to a lot of what building community is all about. And really what happened is Greeks took that co-prefix and added it to a bunch of other words to make it more important. And so more important for them in this regard to socialization. And the idea of social capital is that it's an academic term to describe the idea of networking, in that what you got to do is invest in it and grow it. And you got to put more into it than you take out, because if you don't, you go into deficit and you won't have anything to take out. And so think about it as a bank account. If you put social capital, if you put investments into social capital, grow, it'll compound. And then if you withdraw from that social capital, you can, but you can never take out the principal, because then you'll be into a negative situation. And I think that's an interesting analogy to think about. So here, to close out the ripple effect conversation, are my 10 powers of co. First is connections. And the key here is both weak and strong connections. So it's the people that are close to you, but also those that are less close, the bridging connections they're talked about. And that gives you the opportunity to reach out to different people. And Mark and David talked about it between liberals and conservatives, and someone that was in law versus someone that was in government relations. And also they were super connectors. And so I think that connection with someone who's got a bunch of connections elsewhere is so critically important. And then they started by having conversations. And I think in conversations, it's critically important to remember the idea about listening more than we talk. God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we would listen twice as much as we talk. And so therefore that leads to number 3, communication, which is that it's got to be good, personal, deep communication. It can't just be slogans. It can't just be speaking. It's got to be back and forth communication. And then when I think about how to make social capital successful, you got to have a degree of confidence to go into a crowd, to go into a group, to talk to that stranger, whatever it is. And I think that confidence ends up being critically important. Courage is number 5. And courage is different than confidence, because confidence is that I can do it. Courage is I will do it. I'm going to go out. And you think about that lion in The Wizard of Oz. He had bravery by himself, but when he wanted to act for others, he had courage. And I think that's key. But at the same time, it's compassion. And, I think compassion is different than sympathy. It's different than empathy. It's different than generosity or charity. Compassion is that you've got a passion for that other person because you're compassionate for them. And that's the idea. You've got a passion to help. You got a compassion to live in that other person's shoes. I think commitment is key, because you've got to be committed to your objectives in life, to what you want to achieve in life, to putting in the time, to showing up. Woody Allen said 80% of life was just showing up. I think you got to show up even when you're tired, even when you don't want to, even when you're feeling a little bit strange about going into that situation. And I think because at those networking events, at those places that you're going to go, you'll end up having coincidences. Einstein said coincidences are God's way of staying anonymous. One of my favorite books, The Alchemist, talked about the omens that you run into in life. people have talked about every time God closes a door, he opens a window. Whatever you want to think about that example, but I think it's the coincidences in life that end up being the keys to success. You got to be prepared for luck, as lots of people have said, but be open to those coincidences, be open to those commitments. And more than that, I think it's collisions that end up being critically important, because you're going to collide with someone else, both positive and negative. And I think that's important. There was this great book called Genius that took a look at the cities historically that have been most successful. And they've been where people with different views got together and debated like crazy, but then also weren't enemies. They got together for a beer, or they talked, or they had coffees. And so it's those areas. And they talk about Venice, where it was Christians and Jews that got together. We talked about areas in the Middle East that were Muslims and Jews and Christians that interacted. We talked about Scotland, where people of not different faiths but just different ideas got together in arguing clubs, debate clubs, and argued like crazy, but then got drunk afterwards. And so, having those discussions ends up being important, which leads to number 10, which a lot of people are scared about, but it's competition. And I think competition is healthy. I think competition, when it is healthy competition, not war, not battle, not hatred, the competition like you get in a hockey game where you play like crazy. You can even have your elbows up, I guess. But at the end of the game, you shake hands, because who knows, you might be on Team Canada together in a couple of months. When you think about competition, no one is ever as good as they are going to be unless they compete. I think about the most recent federal election. Mark Carney was a lot better for going through the competition for leader. Some people wanted to anoint him, but he was a lot better because he went through that competition. I think that competition in soccer teams, if you don't have a good competition ahead of time, you're not going to be ready for the big game. And I think it's the same in business. Is competition ends up making you more successful longer term, and you'll compete and be successful longer term than if you are given sort of a protective barriers that you can exist in behind and not have to compete. Anyway, so those are my 10 pairs of co. Hopefully they'll be of some value when you think about the ripple effect and networking. Good night, everybody. Have a great weekend.